Alright, today we're going to be putting in another slasher villain for the Mount Rushmore to join Michael, Freddy, and Jason. But who's left? Well, there's a lot of names, and this one goes by a lot of different aliases. And we're going to be talking about Pinhead from the Hellraiser franchise. Like I said, he has many aliases. He's known as the Hell Priest, the lead Cenobite, the Dark Prince of Pain, one of my favorites, the Black Pope of Hell, and he was also known as the Engineer. Alright, so we always kick these things off with the most important part in a slasher, and that is the kill count. And Pinhead has got himself one hell of a kill count. They have him in at 321 kills, with a whopping 258 coming in the third installment itself. So, obviously, these movies have a good little balance of anywhere from 6 to 12-ish in each movie. We do have 10 movies running from the original kind of male version of Pinhead and the reboot that came out in 2022 where we finally got a female. Which, based on the books, a lot of people said the female is what is represented in Clive Barker's books. So it makes more sense, I guess. But overall, we're going to talk about some of the cool stuff. Starting off with the first movie. So we get a movie that's kind of about this guy who played with the Leviathan configuration, and he ends up bringing the Cenobites. He goes to hell, and then, we see Pinhead at the end. As you're following along each movie, you do get a little bit more lore, and it gets a little bit more into why Pinhead is here, what he does, and that nature until we hit a certain point. Alright, so starting off, one of the biggest things about the lore is the Leviathan configuration. It's this box. You play with it, you learn how to solve this puzzle, and it will bring you pleasure and pain. That is kind of the whole thing of Hellraiser. It's an S&M type scenario where you're going to experience intense pain that is supposed to also be intense pleasure for you. And when you do, you get these Cenobites who come and they're going to drag you to hell for an eternal pleasure and pain experience. The configuration for the most part in all of the movies is just a box, and you kind of play with it, you spin it around and it drops, and it changes its shape a very little bit until you get into, I think it's the end of the third one, where it's actually the entire inside of the hotel ends up being painted like the Leviathan. And then as you move into the movies, it kind of stays the same. But then in the reboot, they did a neat thing on the lore where each stage has these different shapes to it and what you need to do. And when you get somebody to give it blood, because them cutting themselves on it, the Cenobites come take them. And at the end, if you can get to the final configuration, you are given a choice of what you would like. And those choices are obviously a bunch of different things, whether or not you want to become a Cenobite and then have that intense pleasure in playing for the rest of your life, or you can bring people back, you can choose to live. There's a bunch of different options, but it makes it kind of fun because it took the lore of what this was, and they kind of expanded on it and gave it a new feel to it, which was nice. We also got Pinhead. Weapons of choice, the most obvious one is the fact that he can summon chains with hooks on them from anywheres, grab onto you, and rip you apart. Which, that's going to lead into my next kind of fun fact when it comes to why Pinhead deserves to be on the Mount Rushmore is, for the most part, before you got into some pretty shitty sequels, it had some fantastic special effects, practical effects. If you go and sit down and watch the very first Hellraiser, it still holds up to this day. It has amazing effects of when Frank is coming, like they're feeding the blood, so he can bring himself back together, and it's like this gooey monster, and then it's kind of forming into like body with muscle and tissue and blood and slime. It looks fantastic, and for the most part, the movies do look very good, like I said, until the shittier sequels where they start to throw in some CGI and kind of ruin the fun of what Hellraiser is, but some of the later ones do get back to the practical effects, mainly due to the budget, and those movies' effects look way better, like in Hellraiser Judgment. And obviously, the remake went with the practical effects for the most part when it came to kills and stuff like that, and the look of the Cenobites, so it all kind of worked out well. Pinhead did start. He's been in books from Clive Barker. The first one was the Hellbound Heart, and then he was in also Hellbound Hearts. And then Clive Barker also did end up making a comic book series, and then there have been other comic book series based on Pinhead, the character himself, which moves him as more than just iconic for those of us that love horror movies and slashers, because it moves it into another form of media for other people to pick up, which would make him a little bit outside of the norm for some people. Alright, another reason why he deserves to be into the Mount Rushmore is because of the Cenobites. So he's the lead Cenobite, and in all of the movies, he doesn't come alone when he comes to get you. He has a group of friends, so to say, and they all do insanely mean things to you. Enjoy it. But all of the characters, they all look very unique. A lot of S&M black leather, a lot of deformities, and a lot of just very cool looking characters. I know when I watched the first one as a kid, the Chatterer with his teeth chattering the whole time, that one was one that I always loved and thought looked awesome. In later ones, you do get the twins. In the third one, you get the cool guy who shoots CDs out of his head, or is it out of his head? I think it's out of his head. But he shoots CDs at you, which kill you. Unique. And then you do get some much more elaborate looking ones of like monsters that crawl and stuff like that. But overall, all of the Cenobites, they all look very good. The design and the thought process behind them is done very well. It's probably one of the best parts of watching a Hellraiser movie is getting to see the different monsterish designs that the people have come up with when it comes to the Cenobites. Alright, so Pleasure and Pain, the story of Hellraiser. I'm stating it that way because not only is it kind of the forefront of what these movies are about, but that's also what the series is like if you watch it. So I know I'm supposed to be making a case for him. I'm going to do one little negativity thing here when it comes to that, and then I'm going to pop in a few more positives. And the main one is I think of it as a positive that these movies are kind of a variety in the very beginning, and that's what makes them pretty good. Like the first one, it's in a house, it's somebody who's trying to bring back someone they love, and Pinhead comes in at the end to be like, nah, get your ass back to hell. And then the second one, you get this huge world of lore in Hellbound where you get to meet Leviathan and you get to see this whole hell underworld, and it's just very, very like magical and mythical for what it's going for. I mean, we all know there was some budgety issues, and that's why the world doesn't look so great at the very end, because they ran out of money. But it is a very unique take on taking this small one-house world and expanding it into this whole world of hell and going for so much more. And then the third one, they go with Hell on Earth. And with that one, you know, he's stuck in this, it's like a spinning monument type thing. He ends up getting out. And we get to see him and the other Cenobites kind of take on the first real slasher-ish version of Pinhead that you're going to get, where they're just walking around Earth, just killing people. And we get an awesome scene with him in a church where he rips out the one of the pins out of his head, and it's got worms on it, and he does the whole Jesus pose. And I always thought that was very unique and very cool. The fourth one, we get this like weird chapter setup where it's like this is going to take place in like the 1600s, then we have present day, and then we have the future, which is in space. And ironically enough, this is a horror movie that went to space, and it actually kind of made sense. It wasn't the worst choice that they could do. It wasn't far-fetched like Leprechaun in space or Jason in Space, which did not make a whole lot of sense, but this one actually did. But then once the fifth movie hits, you kind of get this same rolling thunder of guy was a bad guy, and you're seeing him living in his hell. And there's like supposed to be this swerve at the end, and there's barely any Cenobites in it. There's barely any Pinhead. And most of the people have said that these are pretty much scripts that were sitting on a shelf. They were like, ooh, if we don't put out something, we're going to lose the rights to Pinhead. Shit, let's throw them in a couple of scenes. Let's call it a Hellraiser movie and spit it out because people will watch it. And the first four movies were released in theaters. And between the four of them, they made almost $48 million in total. But then after that, they went straight to VOD and on demand. And they've all been kind of like that. Where the fifth movie, the sixth movie, and the seventh movie are all kind of similar stories, and they're not very good tales, and they kind of do Pinhead a disservice. The eighth one does a really weird thing where it's like a video game of living in the world of Hellworld with Pinhead. And that one has kind of a unique take on it, but it's more like a genre, like early 2000s slasher of trying to incorporate some technology in there, like the 2000s did a lot. It's not the most horrible story, but it still doesn't feel like it's a Pinhead movie. But you do get Henry Cavill in that, so early Superman, here you are, getting your start in horror. Thank you, Pinhead. And then after that, they ended up going to the world of, let's do a whole entire reboot, and we got the worst looking Pinhead in the entire franchise with, I think it was called Revelations. It was a fairly decent story that kind of followed like what Hellraiser storylines should be. But the special effects and the makeup were just so god-awful that it's like one of the hardest movies to actually sit through and watch. Because you can't take that Pinhead serious. He's no Doug Bradley. And then we got Judgment, which was, to me, is actually one of my favorites from this series. I think it's up there with the original 4. I actually put it above 4. I have a hard time differentiating them. I think the first one is my favorite. I then like the third one for the slasher elements. I like Judgment, and then I like Hellbound. But it was at least like breathing new life into the franchise. It introduced angels for the first time. So all this talk of hell, we finally got a heaven-ish type reference. But this was like a paint-by-numbers detective story. I'm pretty sure it was following the 7 deadly sins this person was killing. And then we find out swerve at the end. It's the same shit that we've been seeing. And the reboot just decided to focus completely on the Cenobites. And that was finally a good choice. This franchise that is based upon a character with pins in his head who has been iconic throughout horror. Everybody knows who he is and everybody loves who he is, and they still haven't really put him in the damn movies. Finally, we get that, and it is a good film. It was definitely a nice breath of fresh air, and it revitalized the franchise to where hopefully we will get a sequel to that one. All right. So that was my little rant, is just the fact that as you moved into the series further, you would think, like most horror franchises, that it would continue to focus mainly on the villain. And instead, these focused on stories that didn't really have the villain in them, but we're just going to throw them in at the end. To where Pinhead doesn't really seem like a villain much at all in these movies. It's actually the character you're following who is kind of the asshole and villain of the entire franchise, each movie at a time. All right. So obviously I'm going to punch in some more positives before we leave this video. One is going to be cosplay, because a lot of people love dressing up as Pinhead, because who wouldn't want to wear black leather and a mask with pins in their head? It looks awesome, and his character is just fun. It's like the epitome of what it says. It's pleasure and pain. It's a great concept, and people just love to dress up as him. And finally, in 2021, we got Pinhead in a video game, Dead by Daylight. They seem to have a spot for every slasher villain. They make room for them in every single little DLC they make. They add a new one in, and Pinhead finally got his due where you could be Pinhead in a video game. Alright, so my final hurrah, besides the fact that Pinhead has had 11 films, is extremely iconic for the fact that his movies aren't that great, but yet people still love this guy. My final thing that I'm going to give it to is I have a list of 10 different movies that have somehow or some way incorporated Pinhead or Hellraiser lore into them when they're not technically Hellraiser at all. Kicking off the first one is Event Horizon, which has literally been labeled Hellraiser in Space. Even though we got Hellraiser in Space in part 4, but it's still a very good movie, and you can tell with some of the brutality and the kills and the special effects and stuff that it did have a Hellraiser type feel to it. Number 2 is going to be Pumpkinhead Ashes to Ashes. You get Doug Bradley in this movie, and there is a configuration on his stand that looks exactly like the Leviathan configuration. 3 is going to be the movie Cursed by Wes Craven. In this movie, there is a character who literally dresses up as Pinhead. 4, we got Bride of Chucky, when we have the kill of the officer, where they cut the cord and the nails go flying up and into his face. And Chucky says, "Why does that look so familiar?" 5 is going to be Cabin in the Woods, when we're looking at all of the different creatures and stuff they can release. We have a guy standing in black leather. He has saw blades in his head, and he's holding onto a ball. Probably the closest reference you can get to Pinhead, because you couldn't get the rights to put him in the actual movie. 6, The Simpsons. There's a Treehouse of Horror episode that literally has Pinhead in it. 7 is Extreme Ghostbusters cartoon, where we have Cenobites. 8, The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. In this one, we do get a character who literally looks very similar to Pinhead, even though it's a kid's cartoon. It doesn't have pins, obviously. It has like these purple orbs, but it has the lines and everything going down the head, so very, very close reference. 9, Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. There was an episode that literally had a box that looked just like the Lament configuration. And 10, we have Rick and Morty with a cursed Rubik's Cube that summons Cenobites. You couldn't get any much more than that. Alright, that's everything I have as to why Pinhead deserves to be on the Mount Rushmore. Do you agree for Pinhead, or does he not make your cut? Let me know in the comments down below, and let me know the next horror slasher villain that you want me to make a case for. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe so you can see more of my content, share this with other people who love horror movies as much as the rest of us. And don't forget to rest in peace.